Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Relative Strangers by Allie Cresswell. Narrated by Pearl Hewitt. October 2004. Friday. As usual, Belinda McKay Don waved her husband and children off in the car. Elliot, her husband in the driving seat, did not even acknowledge her raised arm. He was fiddling testily with his mobile telephone with one hand and jamming the tiny earphone into place with the other. Rob, their son, from his position in the passenger seat, miraculously manoeuvred the car in reverse gear between the gateposts and out into the close. Now that he was 17 and having lessons, he ought to be driving to school with his L-plates on his father's car, practice making perfect. But Elliot was always in too much of a hurry, and in any case hadn't the patience. Even Belinda's patience had been rather stretched on the couple of occasions she had taken Rob out. He tended to drive too quickly, and with reckless disregard for other road users. He had managed, just on the relatively quiet side streets, to have a couple of near misses, and she had had to warn him that if he wasn't careful, he would end up causing an accident. Ellie, in the back seat, was the only one to manage a half-hearted wave as the car roared off up the tree-lined road towards the bypass. Half an hour later, Belinda too drove away from the house. She'd packed their smart luggage into the boot, ramming Wellington boots and waterproofs anachronistically into the spaces, repeatedly checking her list. The full width of the back seat was taken up by boxes of food and cleaning materials, and 2 cold bags, packed at the last minute, were wedged behind the front seats. On the passenger seat rested her handbag, a Tupperware of neatly cut and tightly cling-filled sandwiches, and a sheaf of papers with directions to Hunting Manor. Before leaving, she'd checked again that the doors were firmly locked, the thermostat was turned down low, the cooker was switched off, and the taps tightly closed. Everything was neat and tidy. The beds made, the kitchen floor polished to a high shine, the dishcloth folded and draped over the tap. The linen basket was empty, the ironing done and put away. Even Rob's room, usually a no-go area, was reasonably straight. Belinda was a confident driver, and she negotiated the back end of the school-run traffic with ease, taking a nifty shortcut through an industrial estate to avoid the roadworks near the airport turnoff, and was soon on the motorway cruising at a steady 75 in the middle lane. She had had the idea almost 12 months before, to rent a large house for the autumn half-term holiday, coinciding with her parents' golden wedding anniversary. She wanted to get the whole family together at last for something special that everyone, but particularly her mother Mary, would really enjoy. Left to itself, the family would disintegrate. It was always Belinda who kept them in contact. Only she seemed to care enough to keep the connections. To her, it was a matter of maintaining a firm anchor, reinforcing it with layers of developing association. To others, it seemed to be something that chafed, a kind of restraint, and she was quite aware that when her phone calls or her emails came suggesting a weekend visit or even a lunch, there would be a palpable shrinking, and their acceptances came with weary resignation. Geography made it difficult for Simon now that he lived so far from his hometown, and so far too from McKay ways. Ruth hadn't the excuse of geography. She had remained local. But she seemed to have drifted away from them all one way or another, especially since poor April had died. It was all Belinda could do to get her and James and the children to visit once or twice a year. And Heather? She moved in fashionable, glamorous circles now. In any case, she had always been somewhat otherworldly. It was so long since they had all been together for more than just a few hours, and a tortured few hours at that. April's funeral, the chill of the churchyard and the stilted conversation afterwards in the function room of the hotel. Dad's stroke, and the whispering corridors of the hospital. But Belinda would persevere with it for Mary's sake. She, now the harassed carer of their debilitated father, needed to feel for once their strength and support. At one time, Belinda had turned to Mary as a first resort in any kind of crisis, but recently their roles had been reversed. Now it was Mary who needed help, and Belinda who provided it. Indeed, it was to Belinda that they all turned these days, in times of crisis. Their sudden calls for help, like some ancestral clarion cry, would send her scurrying across the country to administer condolence, or nursing care, or casserole. She now was the linchpin of the family, and she was quietly determined to hold it together. So she had hatched her plan quietly, as she did everything, careful to reflect the glory of it onto others, and yet with a dogged determination to overcome every obstacle. The holiday was to be a long overdue reminder to everyone that Mary mattered, the family mattered. Family, Belinda had read on a picture frame in some gift shop or another, is the link to our past and the bridge to our future. Belinda only wanted to provide the occasion, the venue, to deal with the practicalities which would enable the others to make the links and set foot on the bridges. That, she felt, if any, was her gift. Ruth had once called her, in the newfangled business speak she so often affected these days, a facilitator. Unsure of her meaning, Belinda had finally asked Elliot what it meant. "It means you let others get on with the important things," he'd explained. Well, she'd settle for that. The whole project had taken some considerable organisation, overcoming her brother and sister's reluctance, and getting them to commit themselves to that few days. They had such different ideas. "Oh no, not there. Too far to travel. It isn't like you to be so impractical," from Ruth. "That place, almost on our doorstep. Have you thought about getting somewhere abroad?" from Simon. "Oh, I don't care. You decide. Only do let there be hills and open spaces, Belinda, and trees and a positive aura and room to dance." This from Heather, her youngest sister. In the end, she had found Hunting Manor advertised in the Lady. It was perfect. A stately home of character and quality, peacefully placed in its own grounds, a mile from the village of Hunting Wrigley, easily accessible by road. Luxuriously appointed with every modern convenience, lovingly restored, and tastefully furnished with fixtures and fittings from a bygone age of elegance and refinement. 10 principal bedrooms, plus servants' quarters. This image conjured up both longing and anxiety in Belinda. It sounded perfect, but would she arrive to find a dilapidated pile running with damp and infested with vermin? Oh, surely not. Her conversations with the agents regarding the booking had inspired her with confidence. Spick and span, they had promised, cosy and warm. Unlimited firewood, an enormous Aga, a huge boiler, copious hot water, plenty of space for the kiddies, commodious rooms for the grown-ups, convenience, comfort, practicality, and beauty. What else could any of them require? The sky, which had frowned rain earlier, cleared to show increasing glimpses of blue sky above driven white clouds. Ploughed fields the colour of bitter chocolate gave way to velvet-cropped moorland dotted with sheep, and in the distance, purple mountains suddenly made sense to Belinda of a long-forgotten harvest-time hymn sung at school. The trees shimmered, green and gold, copper and bronze. The lorries and vans which had accompanied her like seagulls above a fishing boat began to drop away, and soon she was almost alone on the ever-unwinding grey ribbon of roadway. She pressed the accelerator a little more, and edged up to 80. The car responded, without demur. As she drove, Belinda cast anxious glances at herself in the rearview mirror. The previous week, for the first time in her life, she had attended a beauty salon to have her eyebrows shaped and lashes dyed. She was still wondering whether she should have had something done with her hair. A colour, perhaps. But this surely would be going too far. She had been discreetly dieting for the past few months, and her face had lost its fleshy roundness. Her cheekbones had emerged. Some of her clothes had grown too big for her, and she had bought new ones in a smaller size. Nobody at all had passed any comment on these changes in her appearance. Certainly not Elliot, and not even Mary, usually so quick to spot any physical alterations in her children. Belinda, while feeling rather proud, dared to make no conscious acknowledgement of the motivation behind these changes. And now she banished those fluttering wings which troubled her from time to time by concentrating on the road. Suddenly, red brake lights and winking hazard lights indicated a stoppage up ahead. The cars in front of her slowed to a snail's pace, and Belinda sighed impatiently. She had so much to do when she got to Hunting Manor. She wanted everything to be ready for when the first arrivals showed up. She crawled along for perhaps a mile or so, keeping pace with a silver Mercedes on her offside and a Walker's Crisps van to her left. Then bollards and the overhead information display indicated that the outside lane was closing, and the Mercedes nosed in front of Belinda with an apologetic wave. A police car and then an ambulance screamed down the hard shoulder, and Belinda knew with a sinking sickness that there must have been an accident. When she came to it, she was surprised to see that the accident had occurred on the opposite carriageway. The outside lane of their carriageway was being closed off for emergency vehicles. This, and the ghoulish propensity of people to slow down and stare, had caused the tailback. The accident looked very nasty. 6 or 7 cars, mangled almost beyond recognition, littered the carriageway. One of them was covered in soapy foam. Plainly it had been on fire. A lorry, not a McKay's vehicle, she noted, had slewed off the road and was on its side down the embankment. A caravan had jackknifed and rammed the central reservation barrier. Luggage was scattered all over the place, camping gear and, sickeningly, children's clothing. A fire crew was working with cutting equipment on one of the cars. On its windscreen, shattered into a mosaic, Belinda could see blood. Ambulance crews were helping the injured. A woman sat on the hard shoulder, weeping over the body of an infant, a day-glow-jacketed paramedic in attendance. A man in a business suit stood in the midst of it all and shouted into his mobile phone. Then she was past the incident, and 3 lanes of stationary traffic tailed back behind the impassable scene for several miles. Amongst it, she spotted the blue and silver of a McKay's haulage vehicle, emblazoned with the nationally recognized byline, "Going the McKay way." The coned-off area finished, the cars on her side of the motorway sped up and off, and there was clear road ahead. Belinda tweaked the indicator. Her exit was coming up. She reached down to the passenger seat and picked up the list of directions. She was nearly there. Elliot escaped from his business lunch appointment at 2:30 and drove onto the ring road towards the industrial estate where the McKay's haulage yard was now situated. His first action as the new chairman had been to sell their seedy backstreet premises and take a lease out on a splendid new compound and office. He had computerized their systems as well, and appointed new staff whose loyalties would be to him and not to old Robert, Elliot's father-in-law, the founder of McKay's. Most of the drivers he had kept on, however. They knew their vehicles and their routes, and so far it had proved impossible to shift Auntie June from her swivel chair in the accounts department. She had been brought in to do the figures in the 60s. Robert believed in family. He wouldn't trust anyone who wasn't family to play any important role in the firm. His sister did the accounts, and Les, her husband, had been taken on as the first additional driver back in those early days of the company. The biggest disappointment of Robert's life had been his failure to persuade his son Simon into the family business. Elliot, taken on straight out of college with an HND in accounting, had soon recognized that his only means of occupying the chair in the boardroom would be via the bed of one of the McKay daughters. He would have to become family. The bed, once he had put his mind to it, hadn't taken him too long, but he had to wait what had seemed an interminable time before taking possession of the chair. Robert had finally retired the previous year following his first stroke. Les had retired at the same time as Robert, but June had stubbornly refused to let go, still appearing in the office 3 times a week, interfering with the accounts clerks, double-checking their figures, crashing the accounts program, and generally getting in the way. She made no secret of the fact that she was keeping an eye on family interests, a ridiculous notion since she wasn't even a director of the firm. But she was, by birth anyway, a McKay, and Elliot had not, yet, liked to oust her for fear of wounding what he thought of as the minefield of McKay family relations. He knew her type anyway, and it was easily managed. She was a leech. In spite of all appearances to the contrary, she didn't have money beyond what she earned at McKay's and Les's pension, and her expensive lifestyle, a big thirsty car, golf and bridge with well-heeled women, expensive boutiques and regular appointments at the beauty salon, meant that she was at the mercy of whoever held the purse strings. She had sucked off Robert and Mary for years, but now Elliot was in control, and when the time came, he would make her dance to his tune. As he drove up the bypass at something over the speed limit, Elliot consoled himself with the fact that, for a family business, apart from June, McKay's haulage was mercifully unburdened with family involvement. How much worse it would be to have the whole litter of McKay cousins and nephews throwing their weight around, lording it in the compound and lounging in the office cubicles, thinking that the business owed them a living, and running up astronomical expense accounts. The McKay siblings had all taken nominal directorships when Robert had had his stroke, but they didn't trouble Elliot with awkward questions or requests to examine the accounts, and as chair, Elliot found it thankfully a very rare necessity to call a board meeting. He had them all more or less where he wanted them. Had Elliot chosen to examine the other side of that coin, he might have had to admit that in fact the McKays had him in a similar grip. He nurtured the McKay nest egg unaided, and largely unappreciated. He got results, but he got little recognition for them from the family. He got little of anything from them, in fact. They tolerated him, and that only for Belinda's sake. But Elliot didn't care. Life wasn't a personality contest, after all. It didn't bother him that he was avoided at conferences, labelled a piranha, or that he was unpopular at the golf club. Nobody could argue with his success, or his ability to get, in the end, exactly what he wanted. He swung off the bypass and began to indicate left, turning into the forecourt of the impressive modern office suite. McKay's was emblazoned in blue and silver across the porch. To his left, a high-walled compound was full of tidily parked wagons, their paint freshly washed and gleaming. A uniformed gatekeeper touched his cap at Elliot as he got out of the car and made for the smoothly gliding glass entrance doors. He glanced at his watch. It was 3:10. He had half an hour to sign off the wages, clear his desk, and get back onto the bypass to collect the children from school. The traffic was bound to be appalling at 4 on the Friday before half-term, and Rob had wheedled him into agreeing to go home to collect the computer on the way. That would put them back even more. He was not looking forward to the holiday at all. A week incarcerated with the McKay clan miles from anywhere was nothing like his idea of fun. But Belinda had had this idea and worried at it like a terrier until he had been railroaded into agreeing. Having to keep the kids in hand, play the adoring uncle to the brats, making jolly conversation with the brothers-in-law, and cope with Belinda, working herself up into a frenzy over the catering arrangements. None of this struck him as being very appealing, even if it was in somebody else's stately home. On the other hand, there were some members of the McKay family who were good value. Simon liked to throw his cash about, as proof that he had made it big without McKay's, and that foxy new woman of his had a certain appeal. Being seen with Jude, the famous brother-in-law, had its attraction too, and since Belinda had organised, and paid for, he'd be bound, the whole deal, that would put Elliot in the driving seat as host. Certainly that would be very satisfactory. It was exactly where he liked to be. The whole family deal with the McKays was something that had been as hard, or harder in some ways, for Elliot to pick up as the business. His own parents had died, and his only sibling lived as a semi-recluse on a barge with a posse of whippets, mercifully undesirous of any involvement with Elliot or his new relations. It had taken him a long time to appreciate the tight-lipped restraint which seemed to characterize family relationships. They tiptoed around each other as though on eggshells, and tolerated each other's failure, feebleness, and foolishness with stiff-necked forbearance. Tolerated it rather than confronted it. McKay fools, it seemed to Elliot anyway, were suffered if not gladly, then stoically. The family tree might be riddled with damp and rot, but as long as the thing looked sound from the outside, that was all that mattered. But surely, Elliot thought, glancing over the documents on his desk, the whole thing was a complete charade. The 4 children had travelled in wildly diverse directions from their humble beginnings. Were they to meet as strangers, they wouldn't give each other the time of day. And yet Belinda relentlessly pursued this family connection long after there was any life or purpose left in it. It was a dead horse, and he wished she would stop flogging it. He was late getting to school. The lay-by was empty of buses and grey-blazered pupils. Even the staff car park was virtually empty. Rob and Ellie were leaning against the railings. He looked furious, she looked miserable. Elliot forestalled their tirade of complaints by snapping in his most authoritative voice, "Don't start! I've had a hell of a day, and if you say one word you can forget the computer. And don't even start to argue about who's going in the front. You can both go in the back, and that's that." The children slithered into the rear of the car, looking daggers at each other, and at the back of their father's head. Elliot roared away from the school gates, raced down the avenue, and took a shortcut through a half-dozen residential streets and a supermarket car park. He drove too quickly, accelerating and braking sharply, throwing the car round the corners and swerving manically to avoid cyclists, pedestrians, and parked cars. Rob got his Palm Pilot out of his blazer pocket and began to play a game on it. Ellie sent plaintive text messages to her friends, berating her father, her brother, school, the holidays, life, and God. It was not going to be a pleasant drive. Hunting Wrigley was a gingerbread village of blue, pink, and jasmine cottages, with low roofs, thickly slated, and tiny windows. The only, street curled in the shape of a horseshoe round a village green, glassily dimpled with a pond complete with ducks, then snaked down a hill and round to the right to encompass an ancient stone church and minute schoolhouse. The road was washed at its lowest point by a bright stream. A narrow stone footbridge saved the villagers' shoes, then climbed again to the top of a rise, where a cluster of newer houses, a small shop, craft barn, and a pub marked the outer perimeter of the village. Further along the lane, terraces of stone cottages punctuated the hedgerows. Low cobble walls in front of them served to restrain pocket-handkerchief-sized gardens, burgeoning with bright purple asters and giant-headed dahlias, blooming still even so late in October. Larger houses and farms were strung out towards the outskirts of the parish, and then there was nothing at all, until on the right a pair of diminutive cottages, and on the left stone gateposts announced Belinda's arrival at Hunting Manor. The driveway took her through a tunnel of trees brazen with the colours of autumn. The drive itself was a golden carpet which sloped quite steeply down between thick banks of mixed shrubs and trees. After a while the trees seemed to retreat, held back by a stalwart hedge of glossy rhododendrons. These too were held severely in check by what looked like an intensive coppicing programme. Some of the bushes had been cut hard back to allow easier passage along the driveway. Skeletal limbs and denuded branches protruded at awkward angles like broken bones. Amputated boughs had been left to compost down. Then the vegetation petered out as the driveway curved round to the left and opened out into a gravelled sweep. To each side of the sweep wide, manicured lawns and the occasional stand of grey-trunked beech trees made a green and golden moat around the house, so that the gravel made a drawbridge to the massive doors. The house itself was reassuringly large, 3-storied, made of pink sandstone, flat-fronted but with a roof-line that bristled with chimneys and gables. There were a number of tall windows on the ground floor and first-floor levels, and smaller, dormer windows on the upper story. To the right, a single-story wing of newer but not recent construction in brick jutted forwards, making an L shape with a pleasant, sheltered paved area in its elbow. Through the tall windows, Belinda could see a snooker table and a grand piano set at opposite ends of an enormous low-ceilinged room. Ridiculously, quite alone on the grand sweeping drive, Belinda clapped her hands in excitement. She walked towards the huge double doors. They were set centrally to the main house, up 2 wide and smooth stone steps and under a portico supported on sandstone pillars. The door, as promised, was unlocked. She pushed it open and went in. The hall was enormous, bathed in the light which streamed as golden as honey through the 2 windows on either side of the door. The wood-panelled walls and wide-bordered floor exuded the sweetness of beeswax. To her left, a fireplace so wide and high that 5 people could have stood abreast within it was ready laid with its wood, its hearth scattered with pine cones and crisp autumn leaves. To the left of the fireplace, a door into the dining room stood ajar. Belinda made a quick note of the number of chairs round the long polished table. 20. Ideal. Before taking in other details. Silver candelabra, another huge fireplace, windows draped with heavy folds of beautifully embroidered curtains. Back in the hall to the right of the fireplace, an alcove stored fishing rods and tackle boxes, a selection of Wellington boots and green waterproof coats, riding hats and crops, and even a beekeeper's hat. Their presence gave a somewhat eerie feeling that the proprietors were still in residence, that Belinda was not entitled at all to be intruding upon them. She paused, listening hard, uncomfortably aware of the flop of her own heart within her ribs, but only silence met her, and gingerly she took off her coat and hung it on one of the pegs before continuing her exploration. Adjacent to the cloakroom, a door gave access to a small windowless bathroom with an old-fashioned but immaculately clean white suite and black-and-white tiled floor. Opposite the front door, a wide and heavily carved staircase rose up 10 or a dozen steps before dividing and sweeping further upwards in 2 broad arcs. To the right of the staircase leading onwards, a corridor gave access to the nether reaches of the house. Belinda peeped into each room, saving detailed examination until her chores were done. A library, a snug little drawing-room, and a huge lounge with French windows opening onto a terrace. To the left of the staircase, an anonymous panelled door led the way into the domestic area. The back of it was covered in padded green material. So that's what a baize door is, she thought to herself. To the right of the front door, opposite the dining room, was a room that exuded masculinity. leather armchairs before yet another fireplace, a roll-top desk, newspaper racks, and a collection.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?